Welcome to Crimes and Minds, the podcast where mental health professionals diagnose true crimes. We're bringing you our first podcast on Valentine's Day because this crime is a twisted story of love, sickness, and evil. The story has been in the spotlight lately, but the crime culminated back in 2015 when Gypsy Rose Blanchard and her boyfriend at the time, Nicholas Godgen, were charged with murdering her mother. Let's dig in and diagnose the case. Warning, this episode of Crimes and Minds contains discussion about violent crimes including murder, sexual assault, and child abuse. If these topics are a trigger for you, please consider skipping this episode.
Okay, yay. Hi, Rachel.
Hi, Joni. How are
How's
you?
good? How are you?
I'm good. So I'm so
Good.
excited to talk about our first case today.
Me too. I'm so excited for our very first episode. Do you want to start by introducing our podcast and ourselves?
So our podcast is called Crimes and Minds, and in it we discuss true crimes and we talk about whether or not the criminal in mind was either a psychopath or has a mental health diagnosis.
Yeah. I'm so excited for this. Rachel and I, are friends and both happen to be in the mental health field. And we have been talking about this for, I feel like, almost a year now. And we are finally doing the thing. So yeah, we're just gonna have a conversation about true crimes, different crimes that have happened, our research of it, and then our perspective, both being therapists. So I can start by introducing myself since it's the
Yeah, go
first
for it.
episode. My name is Joni McLeod. I am a licensed mental health counselor in the state of New York. I own my own private practice where I typically see individuals, adults who have experienced trauma, varying levels of trauma. I also treat anxiety and depression. I'm super passionate about mental health and making mental health services accessible. And so because of that, I hire other clinicians. I'm supervising 2 people right now, and I just want to make mental health care more accessible because I think it is such a need in our world. Yeah, what else? I graduated from Northwestern University where I received my master's, and something interesting about me is I live in New York City, I guess, and I love it. And I just had a baby earlier this year. So that's me. Rachel, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Rachel Porodnik. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I am also practicing in the state of New York. I specialize in addiction and infertility, but also see adults who have anxiety and depression and other mental health disorders. And I'm excited. I just expanded my practice. So I have other clinicians working for me, and I totally agree about making mental health more accessible and just trying to get help to the people who need it.
Awesome. I love that. Yes, so you can see Rachel and I align on a lot in our work. But yeah, we're both just side hobbies, love true crime. And so
Yeah.
that's sort of where this comes in. But we want to make it really clear that we don't treat any of the people we're talking about. Personally, I haven't ever treated someone who's been involved in a criminal case like this. So I just want to throw that out there. It's not like our, specific specialties, but we do have, I think, an interesting point of view from just being in the mental health field. So Rachel, do you want to talk a little bit about the difference between a psychopath and a sociopath, since that's kind of like a trendy thing right now, and also I think misunderstood?
Definitely. So, psychopath is actually not in the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that we use to diagnose cases today. So, it's actually called antisocial personality disorder now, and that is what psychopath and sociopath are classified as. But if we're talking differences between the two, psychopaths are, I want to say, more diabolical
Hmm.
and have lack of care, or I mean, they just don't care if they hurt other people or commit crimes in order to get what they want. And sociopaths I think it's a more common thing, and people are just, they don't really care about the feelings of others, and they don't care about manipulating people to get what they want, but they're not inclined to commit serious crimes like psychopaths.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so the way I like to think about it is antisocial personality disorder is sort of this umbrella, and underneath it are both psychopaths and sociopaths. And if we're thinking about a Venn diagram, there is a few overlapping things, but they are two
Yeah,
separate. They're not technically two separate diagnoses, but they're two separate issues, I guess, that we talk about. And so, yeah, so I agree that psychopath, I think, tends to be what more people mean when they use psychopath and sociopath, right?
mhm,
It's sort of the like intense, silly serial killer, that sort of theme where there's like little or no remorse for the
right.
serious crimes they've committed.
And they often are very charismatic and use that to
Yes.
mask what their true intentions are.
Yes, absolutely. And sociopaths can do the same. However, they're normally not hiding something quite as um, horrific, honestly, as psychopaths are, or quite as extreme, I guess. And so that's maybe some of the differences. And I just like wanted to note too, a lot of times this is diagnosed in childhood as oppositional defiance disorder, ODD, which it's really difficult because I think, unfortunately, in our society, when we get a diagnosis, it becomes this label that follows us around. And a lot of times kids get this label, maybe just from one mental health professional, and
Right.
then that follows them into adulthood and they're looked at a certain way. Which, I mean, I think a lot of kids who do receive a true and honest diagnosis of ODD do tend to go into antisocial personality disorder. That tends to be their diagnosis as an adult. But if for some reason that was misdiagnosed as a kid, which can certainly happen, it's unfortunate that that label does tend to follow them into adulthood too. So that's sort of the age thing on it, is that normally adults are diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder and kids are diagnosed with oppositional defiance disorder.
Right. Cool. So should we
Yeah.
jump into today's case?
Yeah, let's do it. Rachel, give us a little bit of information about who we're talking about today.
Yes, today we're going to be talking about the case of Gypsy Rose Blanchard. She is a victim of Munchausen's by proxy, and she was essentially abused by her mother for most of her entire life. And Munchausen's by proxy is when someone, usually a parent, um, lies and makes it seem like their child is sick in
Mhm,
order to get attention and sympathy.
mhm.
They'll frequently take their child to multiple doctors, and this is what Gypsy Rose experienced to the extreme.
Yes.
So her mother was taking her to, you know, I think like dozens and dozens of doctors, and she
Yeah.
had a number of supposed diagnoses.
Yeah.
Um, so she was diagnosed with epilepsy, vision impairment, hearing impairment, GI reflux, quadriplegia. So she was in a wheelchair and she didn't need to be. Muscular dystrophy, anemia, needed to use a CPAP starting at age 10, asthma, allergies, mild mental retardation. That's what the documentary stated. Leukemia, incontinence, a heart murmur, among other conditions. And her mom just made sure that she was medicated and was unable to really advocate for herself. So, understandably, that's a horrible way to grow up.
Yeah, no kidding. Yes, I mean that list is just, when I saw that on the documentary we're referring to is called Mommy, I think it's called Mommy Dead
Mommy
and
Dead and
Dearest.
Dearest.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
on
it's
HBO.
on HBO Max. And it was released in 2017. And man, that list of diagnoses, or I guess they were the diagnoses diagnoses she received, but they obviously they weren't true, right? And so it is just so daunting to hear all of that. And like Rachel said, there's like attention that her mom, Dee Dee Blanchard, received by her daughter's diagnoses, if you will. And so like they Habitat for Humanity built them a free home, which
Right.
is like one of the bigger assets that they received, but they were really well liked in the community. My understanding is they would often receive like financial help and trips and medical help
Right.
that they otherwise wouldn't have received.
Totally.
Yeah.
And I think what Dee Dee was able to accomplish, you could say, was made more clear by the fact that they were so well established in the community. And doctors in the documentary said that they felt like they couldn't go against what she was actually doing. And so all they could do was write it in their notes that they suspected Munchausen's by proxy.
Yeah. Yeah. That really hit me hard. I'm going to be honest. That was difficult for me because as mental health care professionals, we know what our duties are to report, right? And one of the biggest things that is our duty to report is child abuse. And Munchausen's by proxy is definitely considered child abuse. There's no doubt about it. And it's under the unique category of medical child abuse, which is rare, but it's child abuse nonetheless. And so that was a hard pill for me to swallow because I would like to think if I were treating someone with Munchausen's by proxy or Munchausen's disease, that I would be able to notice it and assess for it. And out of all of the doctors they saw, I mean, I did the math, and if I'm not mistaken, I'm not a mathematician, but the um the documentary said around how many doctor's visits that they had had. And it was something like they were averaging like one doctor's a visit per week of Gypsy's life, which is wild. And so, because that was her whole entire life, we're not talking a few months here or a year, we're talking her entire life. So anyway, that was a hard pill for me to swallow that none of those doctors were compelled enough to assess more seriously for that or to even report them.
Right.
We know that at least one psychiatrist did write in their notes that they suspected this, but that's all we know.
Right, and then Dee Dee requested the medical records, all of the medical records, so when she saw that there was someone suspicious of her and what she was doing, she clearly immediately stopped seeing that doctor and got them out of Gypsy's life.
Yeah, yeah. So essentially, like no doctors had a chance then because she would just go on to the next one. Yeah, I found it interesting. So we also watched the Hulu dramatized version of this story called The Act, which it is dramatized, so not all of
Right.
it is accurate necessarily. And I found it interesting because in that they show one of the doctors kind of getting curious, right? And the doctor calls old doctors of gypsies and tries to consult with them, which is something in a medical field you're allowed to do. And I just found it interesting. At least now, again, this was dramatized. We don't know all the details. There's really no way for us to, since they are medical records and doctors can't speak out necessarily. But that, like, it didn't seem like that got the doctor anywhere on the show, that no one really was
Right.
willing to be like, yeah, I think you're right. Let's look into this deeper.
Yeah, it's definitely so scary that that's possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe, maybe it's because Munchausen's by proxy is pretty rare. I read one statistic. It's really hard to say statistically, like how often this happens. But in America, they believe that there's something like 2.5 million cases of child abuse each year, and that about 1,000 of them are Munchausen by proxy. So it's very rare, right? Um, but it is something that I would like to think again that as a mental health professional and as a mandated reporter that I would be able to assess for more just like clearly than it seems like, Gypsy was ever assessed or Dee Dee really was ever assessed.
Well, I also think it's so scary that Gypsy had a feeding tube that was put in her at a very young age, and Dee Dee was able to just put whatever she wanted into Gypsy's body without her knowledge. So she was frequently drugged up so much that she seemed incompetent by anyone or by all outsiders.
Yeah. That is such a good point, Rachel, is like that feeding tube and honestly by other means as well, probably she was able to just give her anything and everything. Which I think is definitely sort of the crux of the child abuse there
Yeah.
is, giving your kid meds that they don't need, exposing them to chemicals that are harmful. It is just so horrifying that she had access to do that and that doctors continued to put in new feeding tubes and yeah, it's very concerning.
And supplying the medications that were used
Yeah.
chronically.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very interesting and so sad. I mean, just such a sad case. What I don't think we've mentioned yet is what really makes this true crime is if you're not familiar with the case, is that eventually what happened was Gypsy Rose met a boyfriend online and essentially the boyfriend murdered Dee Dee Blanchard, who was Gypsy's mom. And so that's where we're going to get into like psychopath versus sociopath and some of the other pathologies there. But it's such an interesting case because of the Munchausen's by proxy. I think we're
Right.
both nerding out a little bit, right? Because we're in the field and like love doing this research. But yeah, what details did I miss there, Rachel?
I don't think you missed very many details. I think, well, Nick, the boyfriend, did
Yes.
commit the crime, which was
Yeah.
premeditated. Uh,
Yes.
Gypsy was accused of the one organizing the whole
Yeah.
hit.
Yeah.
So, it personally, I think it seemed like her only way out when
Yeah.
I watched the documentary
Yeah.
and Gypsy is in it and she's reflecting on what happened. She said that she could have reached out to her dad, um,
Mm,
which would have been one thing she could do differently.
yeah.
And her dad was featured in the documentary as well.
Uh-huh.
And he was only 17 when she was born.
Oh, I
So
missed that. Wow,
yeah,
so
that's
young.
really young. And
Yeah,
he and her dad separated when Gypsy was very young. And um, I'm just looking at my notes here, but
yeah,
the Gypsy's dad was talking about how he would try to call Gypsy and would
yep,
send child support money, and it was never communicated to Gypsy that her dad actually was a good guy and cared for her and wanted to see her and wanted to talk to her.
yep, yeah. I remember that too from the documentary. I also remember that he says he actually called her on her, I believe it was her 18th
18th
birthday.
birthday, yeah.
Yeah, and Dee Dee, said to him, "Don't mention her turning 18," because part of this Munchausen's by proxy for Dee Dee was lying to Gypsy about her age. And so even, on the documentary showed I believe it was the sheriff or some, officer who was giving a conference the day after they found out about Dee Dee's murder. And he even said, "We have not been able to confirm the age of Gypsy Rose yet," which I found fascinating. That, I mean, even people who work in with crimes that they were unable to find her legitimate age at that point.
Right. So just going back to the crime, actually, Gypsy
Yeah.
had Nick come over to their house, and
Yes.
while Dee Dee was asleep, he came in with a knife and murdered her. Gypsy was hiding in the bathroom and had her hands over her ears so that she minimized hearing what was going on. But she did say she heard her mother screaming for her,
Yeah.
which is
Mm,
also got to be pretty hard.
yeah. No kidding. Yeah, so actually, Nicholas, I believe his last name was Godot. Um, he was, yeah, like Rachel just said, he came to the home. He was from a different state entirely. He actually took a bus down to where Gypsy and her mom lived, and yes, came in the home, used a knife to murder Dee Dee Blanchard.
They
And like
mailed the knife, the murder weapon, back to Nick's
that,
house, and I think
yeah,
that was one of the key pieces in the investigation
I
that
agree.
linked the crime to them.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yes, I think that is so fascinating that they went to the lengths to murder someone, but then were a little careless about the murder weapon, which again I think is another case for Gypsy being, gosh, so sheltered and so abused in her life that she just couldn't even think clearly about details like that.
Right. And in the documentary on HBO, Nick's mother says that he has autism and at the time
Yes.
was diagnosed with Asperger's,
Yep.
which means she said that his mind is always going to be 15 or 16 years old.
Yeah. Yep. So again, that makes sense. And I do think it's important to note here that a diagnosis of autism has nothing to do with antisocial personality disorder.
Right.
You can certainly have autism. There are many people with autism, many autistic people who would never, ever qualify for an antisocial personality diagnosis. For him, they happen to overlap. Well,
Right.
we're assuming, right? But yes, I found that so interesting as well, and it really again shows to the carelessness maybe that they took, is just neither of their brains had the chance, at least at the time, to be fully developed.
Right. They say your brain fully develops, I think, for women at 26 years old, and Gypsy
Yeah.
was much younger than that.
Yeah, and even because she was so sheltered and abused throughout her life, I would assume that her brain wasn't developed to the point of whatever age she was technically on paper.
Right. And she was isolated from other people her own
Yeah.
age. And she only went to school through second grade.
Yeah, I had forgotten that detail.
Mhm.
That is such a good point. So we're talking about, someone who only had the opportunity to have a second grade education, which I think is I mean, all of it is horrific, but I think that's one of the worst things Dee Dee did, was to not offer her kid an education. How just, I don't even have the words. What a just like turning away from one of the best things you can give your kid.
Yeah.
And I mean, there are people across the world who fight hard for an education, and to be in a country where you could access one is and then deny it to your child is just beyond me.
Yeah, definitely. And then when they were arrested, um, Gypsy at first claimed that she had no knowledge of
Yes.
or what do you call it? She had no plans to kill her mother. She was not involved in any
Yeah.
way. And
Yeah.
so that's what she said to the detectives who were investigating the case. And Nick, I think, cracked first and said that it was
Yes.
Gypsy and that she was the one who wanted him to do it and that he
Yeah.
never would have done it if she hadn't asked him to.
Yeah. Yep. That was my understanding as well. And I think that, their messages back and forth confirmed that, right? That she had requested that of him. He also talks about having, or at least implies having multiple personalities, which is another mental illness, multiple personality disorder. And yeah, I thought that was really interesting. He made it seem as though it was like one of his personalities, right? Who actually went through with the murder, but that wasn't always who he was.
Right. And he was also manipulating Gypsy as well. Like he
Yes.
convinced her to do BDSM. Like
Yep.
most people who practice BDSM are not going to be murdering anyone.
Yes. And when it's done consensually, right? There's a huge difference there. But this was my understanding is was either non-consensual or there was a lot of pressure there, which I believe is non-consensual as well.
Yeah. And I think in the documentary it said that like he wanted to rape her mother. And
Yes.
in order to prevent that, Gypsy said he could rape her instead.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that happened either right before the crime or right after the crime.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is, I mean, again, just another gut wrenching detail of the crime. If anyone out there wants to watch The Act, again, it was dramatized on Hulu. But I will also say that there were some really disturbing scenes. The actual murder being one of them. It was really difficult to watch. And yeah, it was those details were fascinating and horrible. And I thought it was really interesting that even though Gypsy did, there were messages that showed that Gypsy was part of planning of the murder of her mom, that she still had sympathy there to be like, no, don't rape her, rape me instead. I thought that was really fascinating.
Yeah, definitely. So sad.
Yeah.
Um, and then when they were both caught, they got very different sentences. So
Yes.
even though Gypsy was accused of organizing and orchestrating the
Yeah.
whole murder, she was charged with 10 years in jail
Uh-huh.
and second degree murder. It was
Hmm.
amended to second degree murder, accounting for mitigating circumstances of being abused for 2 decades by her mother for the purposes of fraud. That's what the HBO documentary said.
Wow.
Nick, though, on the other hand, was convicted of first degree murder and
Yes.
sentenced to life in prison after first pleading not guilty.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. So I think the biggest difference there was second degree murder and first degree murder, right? And yeah, so actually, so as we record this, it is November of 2023, and Gypsy is set to be released from prison next month in December.
Yes.
Now Nick, on the other hand, will spend his entire life in prison. Um, I think this is so relevant and so interesting that she's about to be released.
Right. And she's
Um,
only served 7 years out of the
I was
10
gonna
years
ask.
sentence.
Yeah. So she served 7. I'm assuming it's like good behavior that she was able to get out sooner.
And I remember just from articles I've read her
Yeah.
saying that she felt more free in prison than she ever felt with her mother.
Oh my God. Wow. How that
So
got me.
sad.
Wow. That is so sad. I mean, makes sense. She was literally confined to a wheelchair because of her mother. Um, yeah.
Right. Just completely kept hostage
Yes.
psychologically,
Yeah.
physically, emotionally.
Yes. Absolutely. Medically.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think for that reason, we would not diagnose Gypsy with antisocial personality disorder.
I
Instead,
agree. Yeah.
yeah, we would give her the diagnosis of complex post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yes. Yeah. Which unfortunately, the newest version of the DSM, the DSM-5, does not have CPTSD or complex post traumatic stress disorder as a billable diagnosis. Now, I work with a lot of people who I believe match the criteria for complex post traumatic stress disorder. And unfortunately, I would like not be able to officially diagnose them with that because it's not in the DSM. However, there is post traumatic stress disorder with the sort of condition of chronic. And so if we had to actually give her an official diagnosis from the DSM, I personally would give her PTSD that is chronic, which do you agree with that,
I
Rachel?
totally agree.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, just the amount, and I believe that this was part probably of her lawyer's defense too, is just the amount of trauma she was exposed to in her lifetime was um it, so disturbing. And that there was so much trauma there that it
Right.
was almost an act of self-defense, right?
Totally.
Which I would be interested. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know these details, but I would be interested to know why they didn't see it as an act of self-defense. Which is maybe it was the planning, I guess, that was
Right.
involved. I don't know. Do you have any understanding around that,
I
Rachel?
would say that, and also
Yeah.
she did eventually admit to the crime that she committed,
Yeah.
and she in the documentary says that the things she would have done differently is reached out to her dad for
Yeah.
help and to go live with him. But honestly, at the time, she had no way to contact him. She didn't have his
Yeah.
contact information. She didn't know that he was trying to reach her.
Yeah.
And so it does seem like murder was her only way out.
Yeah. Yeah. And in the documentary, I mean, they show her father and her stepmom, her father's partner or spouse, and they came and they saw her and visited her while she was in jail, and they got to sit down for a conversation. And I mean, it was so I mean, honestly, like so refreshing, right? To see that she had parent figures who
Yes.
wanted to actually be there for her. I found that aspect of the documentary really interesting is the family members who were interviewed. I mean, they had Gypsy's biological grandparents interviewed, her dad and his partner, even a who I believe would be a cousin to Gypsy and was a nephew of Dee Dee. And I mean, pretty much everyone all said that they weren't surprised, right? That
Right.
even when they heard, initially that Gypsy had murdered her mother, because that was sort of what was being put out at the time, that they all said, oh, there's got to be more to the story. We assume,
Yes.
Dee Dee had something to do with this.
Yeah, they all basically said that she is evil.
Yeah.
And I think her dad even accused Dee Dee of killing her own mother. So
Yeah. It was either her dad or
generational.
her grandfather. Yes.
Yeah.
Um,
And then
so
he also
interesting.
said, yeah, and then he also said when he heard that Gypsy had killed her mom and the ashes were, well, she was cremated, he
Uh-huh.
said, flush the ashes down the toilet.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
that's coming from her own father.
Yeah. Yeah, that was really striking. And what I was thinking of while watching this is just the generational trauma that is
Yeah.
so prevalent. And that hopefully, best case scenario over time becomes less and less with each generation. But my goodness, there was so much generational trauma there between Dee Dee's mother, Dee Dee herself, and then Gypsy, those 3 generations. It really this is a case that shows generational trauma like no other.
Yes. And I honestly am surprised that she got any jail time. I don't think
Yeah,
she should have, in my personal opinion. I
yeah,
think maybe she should have been sentenced to psychological care, like
yes,
counseling, and making sure that she sees a professional in the field of mental health so that
yeah,
she can heal.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's such a good point, and I think this often happens in our criminal system, right, in America, is, that the sentences seem, um, just unfair, right?
Yes.
It seems cruel and unusual. And so yeah, I mean they were considering the death penalty initially, which is so disturbing that that was even considered for Gypsy especially.
Right.
And yeah, I agree that can we not provide more mental health services? And this is why we're both passionate about making
Yes.
mental health care more accessible, right? But could the court not have offered just mental health services and maybe probation or something? But to have 10 years be sentenced to 10 years of jail time is a big deal.
Right, when she was truly the victim in all of
Yeah.
this.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really curious. In January of 2024, there is a new, I believe, like docu-series type of show being released from Lifetime that is essentially Gypsy Rose speaking out. And I think that's going to be so fascinating. I'm so interested to hear more about her side of the story, because she was a victim. And I want to know, you know, what does she see for her life from here? And how has the healing process been going? I hope these are questions that we can have answered a little bit.
Right, and so she's getting out actually December 28th,
Oh
like
my
we said,
God.
3 years before her original release date,
Wow.
and she's gonna be 32 years old when she's released.
Wow.
Mhm.
Wow. I mean, thankfully still so young, right? But that means she spent most of her 20s in prison, which is so horrible, so sad.
Very.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
so for all of the reasons we've shared, we believe that she is not a psychopath
Yeah.
or does
No.
not have antisocial personality disorder, and
Yes.
instead we would diagnose her with complex post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yes, absolutely. Um, Rachel, what about Nicholas, the boyfriend? What do you think? What's your hot take on him?
That is an excellent question, which I haven't really given too much thought to, but I mean, off the top of my head, I would say he might actually be a psychopath,
Hmm.
but he also has autism, so that may have complicated matters a
Yeah.
bit.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm really curious about his case. I personally don't know as much about it because we were focusing so much on Gypsy and Dee Dee for this. But I'm wondering, was he tried as a child or as an adult? Because,
I
you know,
think as an adult,
as an adult, okay, because I didn't know if a diagnosis like autism or Asperger's could have you tried as a child instead, being that his mental age maybe was not above 18. I think it was more like 15 or
yeah,
16. Yeah, I agree. I Off the top of my head, I would think a psychopath, right? But
yes,
I am interested in what we call those comorbid diagnoses of having multiple diagnoses and how they all interact with each other. He did get life in prison, but not the death penalty, which the death penalty was also considered for him as well. Um, I personally am not a fan of the death penalty.
yeah,
I'm glad he got prison time. I don't know though. It's messy, right?
it's super messy.
Yeah, yeah. But I absolutely agree. I do, as we're sitting here talking, I wonder about Dee Dee. Was she a sociopath, maybe? She was able to get all of these, she was very manipulative. She was able to get all of these assets, all of this attention, this positive attention by faking these diseases for her daughter. And it was child abuse again.
And
And
the
so,
documentary said that she also killed her mother.
yeah,
So
well, I
I like
think that was
starving.
the assumption, right? Is in the documentary, the act makes it seem as though she did. They heavily imply that, and
Yeah,
it is assumed too in the documentary to some extent.
right. So I would give her the diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder,
Yeah,
aka psychopath,
yeah,
100%,
yeah.
and comorbid, like you said.
Yes. Yeah, and especially if it's absolutely true that she killed her own mother, then yes. Um, yeah, I just so there's so much there again, so much generational trauma, right?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. Any closing thoughts, Rachel? Anything else that we missed? I'm looking at my notes here.
I think we covered everything. I'm just excited for Gypsy to get out and to begin living her own
Yes.
life and
Yes.
life on her terms for the first time.
Yes. I totally agree. I hope that she finds all the freedom in the world and all the healing in the world. I hope she has access to a good therapist and a good mental health care team who can really hold that space for her trauma. One thing I wanted to know is I wrote down a quote from her lawyer that I think really sums up a lot, which says Gypsy has fallen through every crack in the system, which who is so true, just going back to the healthcare system failed her. I think a lot of people failed her in her life to not be able to see the abuse that she was enduring.
Right.
Um, and so, yes, I again just wish her the best. I really hope that she's able to find some healing in all of this.
Definitely.
Um, yeah, anything else?
I think that's about it. So
Wow.
thank you for joining us on our first
Yeah.
podcast.
Thanks for listening. We're so excited. We plan to come back with other relevant true crime stories and sort of give you our, professional opinion on them. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
If you or someone you know is in need of help, please call 988 to access the National Suicide and Crisis Line. For additional resources, please visit NAMI, N-A-M-I.org.